being mindful of time, we'll just move on to our final speaker, which is Dr. Monique Botha.
Oh, that's in the way, but it's happening now. Hi all. So I'm going to begin by saying if this talk isn't up to scratch compared to usual, it's probably got something to do with the fact that I'm tired and in pain because Singapore Airlines smashed my wheelchair, so I don't actually have my own wheelchair at the moment, and I've got to do a lot more walking and moving, and actually it's really exhausting. But I'm here, I'm in one piece, unlike my wheelchair, and I'm going to give this a go. I'm actually this sounds a bit bad, but I've spent 4 years doing this fellowship on humanizing autistic people in autism research and some of the consequences of the fact that we are dehumanized and objectified. And I'm kind of sick of it, which sounds really bad, but it's exhausting to have to explain to other researchers about the fact that we should be treated like we're human. But I've been thinking about these imagined futures, and it's one of the things that has really kept me going. So no matter how painful, genuinely painful the topic is, I think that there is an imagined future where autism research actually serves autistic people. I'm a psychologist kind of reluctantly. No offense to the other psychologists in the room, but we don't have a good track record between creating norms and trajectories and moralizing them through to a very particular kind of violence. And there is this temporal shift because everyone's like, oh no, we only used to do eugenics and we only used to do phrenology. And then you still get papers published that have graphs like this one that argue that like autistic people are less domesticated than non-autistic people, and they create graphs where they're like, look at their ears and the shape of their head, look at their large foreheads. I like to think that obviously that's not particularly true because bangs don't suit me. Really cannot pull off a fringe, so I'm hoping that my forehead isn't large, but whatever. And I like to think of this in terms of this theory called agental realism. And it's this theory that researchers are constantly creating essentially materialities with science as they work with it. And I think of it in terms of Escher's hands, right? Which is that we are creating the material realities as researchers that actually come to influence both how we think of autistic people and how the world does. And the truth is that psychologists are often creating violent materialities for autistic people. It's dehumanizing rhetoric that treats us as subhuman or objectifies us. It creates conditions for other people to objectify us or think that it's okay to objectify us. Then when we feel the consequences of that through things like poor outcomes, whether that's depression, anxiety, any of the mental health outcomes, or the increased victimization rate that we face, then everyone's like, oh, look, there must be something wrong with them because they're doing so poorly, without actually thinking about how we have played a role in this. And when I talk about these issues, a lot of people kind of split it down, like, is this an empirical problem or a theoretical one? Like, where are we going wrong? And there is this increased focus on things like the replication crisis, and the fact that results don't replicate across studies. There's a focus on open science, which is where you publish about your hypotheses before you collect the data. Might be data sharing, you make your data freely available. But I think that this can easily give way to methodology, which is where we prioritize method over meaning. I don't think this is actually going to solve what's going wrong with autism research, because at its core, we have a meaning crisis, not necessarily a practical one. Data sharing isn't going to fix the fact that autism researchers are often treating autistic people as subhuman. So part of my work has been focusing on how do we recognize objectification and dehumanization in autism research across all the different parts of the process. Not just like looking at quality issues in data analysis or replication, but across the entire lifespan. And this paper is, pardon my language, but fucking haunting me. I've been writing it for 4 years. I now have a kid. I wasn't pregnant when I started. He's 2.5. These are some of the signs that are important. So conceptualization assumes autistic people are inherently deficit or other, ignores intersectional demographics, reducing us just to autism, focuses on our utility to society, right? We've got to be the useful kind of autistic. In preliminary research, it can come across as like discounting autistic people's epistemic value. So discounting things like biography or narrative, assuming that autistic people inherently lack self-insight. Coming from a neurotypical, that would be funny, but whatever. In terms of defining research question, for example, assuming inherent worse ability or performance from the get-go with no justification other than they're autistic. It might be positing questions on whether autistic people possess core human traits, like cough, cough, theory of mind. Not good, right? Like you can't decide that something is a core human feature and then be like, do autistic people really have it? And think that that's anything other than dehumanization. In terms of study design, it might be comparatively using measures that are normed on non-autistic people, and then being shocked when they outperform autistic people and being like, this must be an inherent quality of the autistic person and not a shit measure. It could be failing to measure adverse outcomes. So that's a norm in intervention research, but we don't really do it in autism research because we're like, these people can't really be harmed, right? It might be tokenizing or harming autistic people, including giving them study criteria that isn't actually accessible, right? So you give them something that's not accessible to them, they can't do it, and then you're like, look, there's the deficit. In terms of data analysis, it's things like omitting data analysis on harms or excluding other demographic variables that might actually better explain things through things like intersectional disadvantage. In interpretation, it looks like describing autistic people is inherently lacking or subhuman. It could be looking at data where there are differences, meaningful differences, and reducing it to autistic traits rather than contextualizing it, or it could be using underdetermined data to determine the inherent inferiority of autistic people. I think where people see a lot of this dehumanization, and can name it more easily, is in dissemination, where you see things like calling autistic people part of an epidemic, assuming autistic people are not consumers of research, so talking about us without us, and then when we talk back, being like, oh, no, you're being offended with something that you shouldn't really be engaging in. Which we saw this a couple of years ago, where Spectrum News wrote an article bullying an autistic advocate for saying, don't call people cases of autism, but whatever. It's dehumanizing language, so a language which compares us to animals or childlike or machine comparisons. It's in cost versus value comparisons. We still have these published today where everyone assumes that autistic people bring nothing to communities or the economy. And then plus there's a number about how much we cost per year. Or it could be othering languages that treat autistic people as otherworldly from a different place, as inherently cut off from non-autistic communities or autistic communities or any communities. And I've been thinking about a framework of social and cultural responsibility, because I do think that research can change people's lives, autistic people's lives, but we need to fundamentally rethink how we do science. I think we can think about rigor in terms of transparency in both collection and use of data. And we saw this really come up with the Spectrum 10K study a while ago, where people are like, but we have no idea what you're really going to do with this data, right? And autistic people should be in control of the data that they give away because it is precious. like, it is precious, especially biological data, any data, data about our harm, our narratives, our lives. It is such a gift to researchers, and a lot of researchers don't tend to think about data in that kind of way, and they don't tend to think about how much autistic people give away when they give us that information. We need robust methods, we need triangulation with community testimony, and that includes things like open science, but open science has limitations. For example, we did a project on intimate partner violence, and we had a mandate, because it was government funding, to make it a certain degree of open, but we had to, and we did put safeguards in place, because actually, no, not everyone needs access to that data. And we need to think about how to implement things like open science really delicately, given the kinds of experiences that autistic people have. We need responsibility for the process and the product of research. Every single researcher who has their work being plastered and used in the most divisive, grotesque ways at the moment also have a responsibility to be like, no, that's not actually what my research says, right? Because at the end of the day, autistic people, neurodivergent people are political targets right now, and people are using research in very particular kind of ways, and we need to acknowledge that. And it doesn't stop when you publish the study. You have an obligation to that work and to the community for the lifetime. We need active redistribution of power, including preventing the removal of agency, because that's what researchers tend to do. We don't give autistic people agency, we tend to remove it in the process of research, and we need to stop that. And that also means the power to lead, to veto, it means the power to just stop a project in its tracks, it's dead, right? Co-researchers need to be able to say, no, actually you've done something wrong, not just be show-ponied once a year to be like, we're working with autistic people. I see the red card coming, he's gonna chase me with it. I'll finish up the next, I actually do have more slides, but I'm stopping here anyway because time is wibbly wobbly. Impact not only outwards, but inwards. If you are not breaking down the systems that lead to these kind of violences, you're usually supporting it. Like, it's one or the other, right? So either you are going to be a researcher who tackles the objectification and dehumanization of autistic people, or instead you are going to be a person who upholds that tradition. We need to challenge people with that. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm going to stop there.
I was going to say thanks so much, Monique, for her really powerful presentation. So we might just take a final question from the floor. So we might just take from this gentleman here. No.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe not really a question, but a reflection. I'm a researcher myself, and as much as I would love to be as inclusive as possible, I'm afraid that one of the big issues is not on, maybe not necessarily the ignorance on the researchers' part, but one of the major issues is how studies are funded and the pressure on publication. For example, I would love to do research on more marginalized communities, but because that kind of research requires more funding, more time, and usually we researchers, especially the early career ones, we don't have as much resources as we would like to have, and we have to limit or are limited from the external sources, external circumstances, just because the way that certain studies are prioritized is just messed up.
So I just wanted to say absolutely, because there are academic pressures that push us into essentially poor behavior. I'm actually only officially starting my first permanent job 10 years after my PhD, the 1st of October this year. That's when I'm taking up my lectureship, and the entire time I've been on precarious contracts. And I think that that does, because we've got to publish or perish thing. It's like, you've got to get a publication into the best journals, you've got to get as many publications as possible, you've got to do anything that you can to get there. And I think that actually one of the first steps is realizing that there is harm limitation, and there are ways of practicing harm limitation. So for example, one of the practices I've seen pop up at the moment that I will never, ever, ever engage in is people harvesting data from Reddit communities and doing secondary or like an analysis on that without asking for consent or permission. Because in a lot of ways, it's an easier way of getting data, isn't it, than sitting down asking, which is time intensive. Interviewing is time intensive, it costs money. But it's also a really unethical practice in a lot of ways, because it's going into communities, harvesting that data without actually engaging with those people, and then also going through this process of analyzing essentially their stories, their words out of context. And it's super extractive. It treats those communities as really permeable just because they're online. And I think part of the reason that these things are happening is because of that pressure. I think that it is in that context of that pressure. But also, I think there are ways of still not doing certain things because they're harmful. And the very first publication, I had to do a lot of pushback because they're like, you've got to call this people with autism. And I was like, not today, Satan. I'm not going to do that. And it was really hard because I also needed the publication. And I think there are ways of resisting this culture and then also building a kind of newer culture for the people who are below us in that trajectory. So this is one of the things now that I've got some semblance of permanency and power. I think it's possible to create a kinder academia that's focused on things that do not objectify the communities that we work with. So I think it's about fostering those imagined futures, right? Those better futures. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time and your attention. And I particularly would like to thank Laura, Tara, Monique, and Chloe for their really insightful contributions as well. So this kind of this finishes our session, this breakout session for this afternoon. So we wish you a lovely rest of your Congress and have a lovely afternoon.